Facultad de Ciencias. Vamos a darle un fuerte aplauso a nuestros invitados. El doctor, ustedes ya saben que es un premio Nobel de Matemáticas y Economía, James Mirrlees. Bienvenido a la facultad. Welcome to the Faculty of Science. Thank you very much for being here. Y gracias a todos, le voy a dar la palabra al doctor Seade. El Instituto de Matemáticas invitó al doctor James Mirrlees y el Instituto de Matemáticas quiso compartirlo con la Facultad de Ciencias, quiso que ustedes escuchen a este distinguido profesor y lo va a presentar el doctor Seade. Gracias por traerlo a la facultad.
Muy buenos días a todos. Bueno, quiero antes que nada agradecer a la Facultad de Ciencias por acogernos aquí, en esta institución insignia de la ciencia en México. También quiero agradecer a la Coordinación de Universidad Abierta de Educación a Distancia de la UNAM, que pues gracias a ellos esta transmisión está siendo transmitida en vivo, cualquiera se puede conectar y sé que en este momento hay gente escuchando esta conferencia en distintas partes del país. Realmente es un honor, un gusto estar con ustedes. El profesor Mirrlees recibió el premio Nobel en Economía en 1996 por su contribución a la teoría de la información, de la rama del conocimiento de la economía que se llama teoría de economía de la información. Hizo trabajos fundamentales, contribuciones fundamentales que se han convertido en la base de campos tan diversos como las finanzas públicas, los mercados financieros y amplias áreas de la teoría del consumidor. Por ello, no es exagerado decir que el profesor Mirrlees es uno de los más destacados premios Nobel de Economía y su trabajo es uno de los pilares fundamentales en la ciencia económica moderna. Él estudió y se graduó en matemáticas en la Universidad de Edimburgo y más tarde hizo su doctorado en economía en la Universidad de Cambridge en Inglaterra. Inicialmente especializado en economías de los países más pobres, aplicó técnicas matemáticas avanzadas para el entendimiento de los aspectos sociales y económicos. A muy temprana edad ocupó el puesto más importante que hay en economía en la Universidad de Oxford, y ahí publicó los trabajos por los que más tarde le dieron el premio Nobel. En 1995 regresó a Cambridge como profesor de economía y actualmente él es profesor emérito de economía política de la Universidad de Cambridge, y desde el 2009 tiene el título de profesor distinguido en la Universidad China de Hong Kong. Desafortunadamente se me olvidó mi segundo hit en algún lugar, entonces quiero decir que recientemente el profesor Mirrlees dijo que él sentía que había mucho trabajo por hacer todavía en saber, entender, en profundizar cómo los cambios de opinión de las personas se debían reflejar en políticas económicas. Es un campo de acción en el cual hay mucho trabajo por hacer y ciertamente las matemáticas tienen mucho que decir. Es realmente un privilegio para la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México y para nuestro país tener al profesor James Mirrlees con nosotros. Hoy nos va a dar su tercera conferencia y última conferencia de esta visita a México, que es, bueno, ya ven el título, el título original era un poquito diferente, pero lo mismo, que es las causas y la forma de tratar la inequidad social y económica. Como hay gente escuchándonos en otras partes del país por streaming, les pido que sus preguntas las guarden para el final y les pido que por favor le demos la bienvenida al profesor James Mirrlees.
Thank you very much for what I suspect were excessively flattering remarks. But one of the great pleasures of coming to a country where I don't know the language is I don't have to listen to it. It's always very embarrassing. Inequality is increasingly unpopular feature and a very popular subject nowadays. Everybody in economics is talking about inequality. There's a very successful, deservedly successful book by Thomas Piketty, a French economist, which I think is a really fascinating and very interesting book, which I'm going to be somewhat disagreeing with. And those of you who know, those who may find particular interest in that. The way things have worked out, I will be talking mainly about economic inequality, which is probably what you would expect. And I will talk mainly about the causes. That's because what you do about it seems to me to depend very much on what you decide the causes are. That seems an obvious scientific way of approaching things, so let's proceed. Remind you of a figure that many of you, maybe all of you, have seen before. Oxfam, last year sometime, came out with a report claiming that 85 individuals, have as much wealth among them as the least wealthy half of the world population. That certainly sounds very dramatic. Economists and mathematicians probably prefer simply to put a number to it. And people are increasingly aware that there is an index that measures the degree of inequality in the distribution. It's essentially based on the sum of differences between different people's incomes. So, in a sense, it looks at the average difference and compares that with the most unequal, which is, of course, when one person was and the least unequal, which is when everybody is the same. For wealth, I'm sure I'll be talking more about this, that these wealth distributions that have been put together are not very accurate, but it's the best we have. And for the world, the current Gini coefficient is 0.8 out of a maximum of 1. Sounds pretty big, although even if one doesn't make sense of it. One should see what things are like elsewhere. Quite intriguing that the USA has the same degree of inequality of wealth within the country as the world as a whole. Which, when you think about it, imagine that there are many countries much, much poorer in some sense than the USA. It seems very strange that the richest country of all should have such a high degree of inequality of wealth. And then China, which probably nowadays has more of a reputation for unequal wealth than the USA, 0.55, which is the same as Japan, which has the reputation for being a relatively equal country. So who knows whether this is completely right. Now income, and I will be claiming that in many ways income might be something that's more sensible to seek out. Gini coefficients for income are much smaller than that, but they still look pretty large. The United States Gini for income after tax is 0.38. That's obviously an awful lot less than the inequality of wealth. But that's sort of what you'd expect, although perhaps it's a slightly extreme distance. But I want to take up more time with quoting Gini coefficients to get into the question of whether what it may be that you're hearing about. Is it surprising or is it shocking? One perfectly reasonable reaction to the Oxfam figures might say, well, okay, the half of the world population that doesn't have any wealth, doesn't have very much, maybe that's just the children. Obviously that's not what Oxfam meant, but most children have no wealth. And indeed, a lot of people don't have very much wealth at all until they get to 30 or so. So familiar ideas, the life cycle, that most start with practically nothing, and they save during their lifetime. They don't only save, of course, now we come to something that Piketty emphasizes a great deal. Coming from France, it's understandable that it's sure, which is inheritance. But for most people, inheritance happens quite late in life. Certainly in Britain, most people inherit, if they inherit anything much from their parents, they inherit it when they don't need it. And that's fine because you don't want. You'd rather have your parents than their wealth. Most people would rather have their parents than their wealth. So that's not something to complain about. Where is it coming from? Well, it's not simply that you've got inequality in wealth over your own lifetime, which is bound to contribute to the overall measure of wealth inequality. Also, perfectly obviously, different people earn different amounts, and there is inequality of labour earnings, and that implies that some people will do more saving than others, build up more wealth than others. So that's bound to be an important source of inequality. Because of that consideration, you wouldn't want to say that everything is satisfactory with the distribution of labour earnings. But still, you're thinking of the lifetime inequality. Having inequality of wealth is not obviously undesirable. Indeed, the ideal distribution of wealth would presumably be one where older people have more wealth. There are alternatives to that, like having pensions entirely arranged by the government. Of course, that's another reason why a lot of people might not have any wealth. They might live in countries where, like Germany, where you get a perfectly satisfactory pension without having to do any saving. Just to add to it, in Germany, probably a particularly large number of people live in rented property rather than buying a house. So there isn't so much reason to have a lot of wealth. Nevertheless, if you look in detail at the distribution of where rich people are, quite a number of very rich people, measured by wealth in Germany. What would we really like to do if we wanted to know how unequally is wealth distributed? I'll bring this up as a question you might like to think about. Indeed, I'd be quite curious to know what people think of the way to do it. It looks as though you would ideally like to add up the wealth that people have at different ages. And so for a typical individual, say, what is the total lifetime wealth in this peculiar sense of adding it up over time? I don't think you want to take the maximum, because there are different patterns of saving and so on. Or should it be the average? Now, what I'm raising here is a different kind of source of inequality. Some people may not live as long as others. if you don't live quite as long, should you, and therefore presumably, as a total, adding up the wealth in different years, a different total, does that mean that you're automatically unequal from the person who lived longer and had the same amount of wealth while they were both the same age? Difficult to say. Well, nobody has tried to do a distribution this way, where you try to allow for the life cycle effect. This was one of the places where I thought that Piketty in his book was not perhaps being as careful in his arguments as he might be. He was rather dismissive of the inequality of wealth distribution that arises from the life cycle, and says it just couldn't look like the distribution that we get. I know that's not really right, and I want to tell you about a kind of back-of-the-envelope calculation that was done by one of my colleagues in Britain for the Royal Commission on the distribution of human wealth. This goes back, I suppose, something like 30 or 40 years. And he tried to see, as well as one could, whether the observed distribution of wealth in Britain, which of course had been estimated at that time, was just the result of people saving during their lifetime and having unequal earnings. In other words, was it only the result of these two causes of inequality of labour earnings and the fact that it takes time to build up wealth, say, year by year. A previous calculation had been done by Professor Tony Atkins, but he didn't have inequality of labour earnings in his calculations, so it probably didn't work. But John Fleming, who is the person referring to, found that he pretty much calculated the same result. The inequality of wealth was just what you would expect to have occurred if you ignored any issue of inheritance. So this is going to be playing quite a part in what I go on to say, meaning that I think that probably exaggerated the extent to which inequality of wealth is merely something that happens and not is something to think about and worry about in itself. We should concentrate on labour earnings. I don't think that's entirely right, but one shouldn't think of something like inheritance as looking like a major cause of inequality in this sphere. I do want to say something about other inequalities, and I want to do that in the context of this question, how much we should be worrying and caring about inequality. By the way, I wouldn't be talking about the subject if I didn't think it was a matter of great concern, but I think one should at least think about it. Everybody is well aware that there are many kinds of inequalities, not just economic inequality. Some people have more money than others. People look different from one another. And, people are in different locations. I mean, you might have a nice view outside your house or not. People have different strength, different health. They live for different lengths of time. They have different abilities and, of course, different opportunities. Equality of opportunity is a matter of great concern. connected with inequalities in the treatment of different groups. Obviously, that is something that we're very worried about, but I think it's poor opportunities for some people to be thinking about, rather than the inequality as such. Environment people, some people live in places where the environment is particularly unpleasant. Well, that's a sort of almost economic issue, but it's not only economic. I suggest that, although we may notice, in a sense, be very concerned about the lack of some of these good qualities, I don't think that we care nearly so much about when there's inequalities. Not likely to have demonstrations against. We do care about what other people are deprived of, much in the way that we care about people in poverty, economics, or something ought to be done about that. Similarly, we may care about some people having poor health. I think that that's something that the rest of us have a responsibility to do something about as well. Economic inequality seems to be special amongst all the different features of variance because it can be changed. I suggest that's the real reason why it has somehow jumped to the top of the thinking about these issues. But in saying that, that gives me a chance to point out that there may be ways of doing something about the other inequalities. And that's the question of whether there should be compensation. Should you be giving money to the ill, not just to pay for treatment, but to compensate them for being unfortunate in this particular dimension of life? Now, if what you think is the ideal is equality in some much grander sense than just economic equality, then we really have to take the issues of this kind quite seriously. And I think it does raise embarrassing and awkward questions, like whether you would compensate people for being ugly. Surely not. But the logic of the suggestion is not. Now, I want to mention that for economists, this is a peculiarly difficult problem, because economists are used to the idea that improving the distribution of income, for example, means taking income from one person and giving it to another. And they take it for granted that you should then consider how much harm do you do by taking income from A, and how much good do you do by giving income to B. So what you're trying to do is to take it away from somebody who will do little harm and give it to somebody who will do a lot of good. So you would be thoroughly happy with the situation if the marginal gain from giving is the same as the marginal loss from taking. And that in many situations is not the same as having the same general level of well-being in both cases. The most obvious example of that would be this question of whether you should compensate people for being very ill. Because if you're very ill, it may well be that expensive and even impossible to bring somebody who is an unfortunate condition up to the level of others. This is not even to raise the issue about the differences in temperament between people. There's some people who just enjoy life more than others because of this life. But I think there is a case for wondering whether we should be trying to get measures of human wealth, much in the analogy that people nowadays talk of trying to get measures of green wealth or green income. And the Human Development Index, which only manages to do an indicator of health and something about education in addition to income. And inequality, economic inequality comes in. But one could try to do something much grander, be expensive. But should we care about economic inequality? You say, why might we? But immediately the trouble is that when I say should we care about economic inequality, that means should we care about some people having a lot more than others? Since I've already pointed out that it would be totally uncontroversial to say that we should care about some people having not very much. That's an absolute question. But not on the grounds of envy, I hope, because that is rightly regarded as one of the deadly sins. And wouldn't therefore be a proper ground for any kind of policy of prevention. Well, on the face of it, the real argument for being struck by the Oxfam number is this notion that the rich have much more money than they need, and it could be used to much better purpose if it were taken away and spent on these other much better purposes to deal with deprivations. And I think that's fair enough. But I'm struck by examples where people clearly don't mind at all that certain individuals are very rich. If you think of the rich person as a banker, you probably, most people probably think, terrible. But as a football player, yes, for sure. But this looks anyway like a reason for being concerned about income consumption, not wealth. Wealth is just a kind of something you can calculate on the basis of the life cycle I was talking about. So it seems really to be an irrelevance to judgments about what should be done. But there is this big concern about inequality. The rich, and that means people with wealth, are in a position to change the political behavior of the parties in all kinds of ways. So it happens a lot in the United States. Possibly in Mexico, much less in Europe, but or rather it's more hidden in Europe. And it's hard to say whether it really operates in China. And for this, it's not entirely clear whether you should pay attention to wealth or income, but at any rate, there's a case for thinking wealth in order to do the matters there. So we probably shouldn't lose sight of wealth inequality. Now it's time to get down to the question of causes of inequality. I'm going to list 3 things. We're just doing lists as a very primitive way of always thinking. But sometimes it's a help, because it probably, in this case, very different kinds of reasons for different causes. The obvious thing is earnings inequality. Today is not the occasion for getting into why there are differences in earnings. What should be done about it? Although a very important issue. But then another source of unequal incomes is that some people have more capital than others, and capital earns money sometimes. Just at the moment, for most people, it doesn't earn very much in real terms, because inflation tends to be more than the interest that you would get on your savings. And there is a third thing, source of inequality, which is that in addition to capital being unequally distributed, leading to different income, the return you get on the capital, how many percentage per peso, is very variable. Well, you know it varies. You know that some people get more in their investments than others. And that's going to prove to be an interesting thing to think about as we go on. And the question is why, and I will comment on this properly later, because investments and innovations are intrinsically uncertain in the result. The economy needs that kind of thing to be going on, but it generates inequality. So the 3 sources. Good unequal wealth, that was unequal incomes, you see. Then what about the unequal wealth? Well, of course it comes from past unequal incomes, because that leads to different rates of saving. And then the saving may be different for other reasons, because of profits and losses, which are random and uncertain, random windfalls. And of course, with varying giving and receiving. Giving, of course, like charitable giving. Receiving might be like inheritance. These also make a difference with the distribution. Okay, I think that gives a framework for what we're looking at. But that was all very much in the context of within a particular country, although it also applies to income. It was also interesting to consider the inequality among countries, because the Oxfam statistic was something about the whole world. And when I talk about real numbers in a few minutes, that's going to be about the whole world. So, see what about that. I know it's widely believed that inequality in the whole world is growing rather rapidly. I claim not that it's falling in most measures, which is because such a large part of the world of Asia has faster growth rates from a lower income level than the rest of the world. So there's a lot of catching up. So why are countries different? Why do they have different national income per head? Well, major reason is some have much more capital per head than others. I mean, actual physical productive capital in the country makes an enormous difference. And skill and education is pretty unequally distributed. Both of these things may change quite rapidly over time. At the moment in time, that's the way it is. And of course, resource endowments are tremendously different amongst countries. change very rapidly over time. This is perhaps the moment just to mention that there are some countries where much of the capital is actually owned by the state, and therefore couldn't come into the measures of inequality of capital distribution. It's ignored by these wealth distribution figures. And you may be interested to know that one example of that is Hong Kong. The capital in question there is the land. Because all the land of Hong Kong is owned by the state and government. And that means that quite a lot of the government's revenue comes from land, and it doesn't have to levy taxes. So in effect, that means that people have effective income from that land, which is being used by the government, but it's being used to provide them with schools and police and so on. So that it should really be part of a situation, but it's ignored. Now, how important are the different causes that I talked about? How much of the inequality that we're actually seeing comes from differences in earning power, how much from differences in property ownership, and how much differences in the income that comes from capital? I started looking into the ongoing research that I'm going to be reporting on the basis of a conjecture that the randomness of returns to capital is a major cause of inequality, although for some reason not much referred to. Reinvestment, as I already remarked, is intrinsically risky, so the differences in the returns you get from investment may not much reflect skill differences. Here, referring to a very thorny issue, let me put it in slightly human terms. Warren Buffett, one of the richest people in the world, has been quoted as saying that if a company employs an economist, they're employing one person too many. He doesn't think much of economists. Economists, of course, are people who think Warren Buffett's high wealth is just the result of luck. And we'll have to come back to that issue, and there won't be time to finally settle it. But it's an important question. What can I do about this conjecture? How can I find out? Well, I'm not going to be able to find out very accurately. What's needed is a sample of people with different wealth and income, where we're actually able to follow their experience over time, see what happens to their wealth over time as they invest it or fail to invest it or whatever. Well, there is data, unfortunately only for the very rich, and unfortunately it's hard to tell whether Forbes does this very accurately. But at least Forbes does try to list the wealth of everybody in the world who has at least $1 billion US. So, and they do this annually. Of course, people appear on the lists, disappear from the lists, but it is at least a sample of some people. And there is the extra interest in this that we should be able to test the idea that the very rich are able to get a better return on their capital than the not so very rich, and will therefore become richer still, which is common view. So I think this very interesting fund of data should be used. And of course, it might be a particularly useful set of data because since we're talking about people with at least $1 billion US, they presumably in any year consume only a very small part of their wealth. So the observations you're getting are not disturbed by the inconvenient fact that most people spend quite a substantial figure relative to their wealth and possible savings each year. What I've done with enormous help from an economics student working as my research assistant in Hong Kong was to use wealth data for the years 2004 to 2014. You may well wonder why such a short period. Well, of course, it's very important to realize, it's down there at the bottom of the slide, that people who are very rich in that sense are also a wee bit old. 64.5 is the average age of people on this top 100 list in 2004. But top 100 is smaller than billionaires, but I had to make the task reasonably small. The reason for wanting to take only a subset of the billionaires is because then the hope is that not too many of them will have disappeared off the list by 2014. Now it was found that in that period, 20 disappeared. You couldn't find their wealth. Well, actually it turned out you could find almost all their wealth. I think it was about 17 or 18 of them had died in the course of the 10 years. So you don't want to say the wealth is zero, but it goes to somebody else. It might all have been donated to the US government or the government paid off the national debt. You notice that this high wealth at a high age is a very important phenomenon in understanding what you've got here. It underscores this consideration that people don't come into the world at the beginning of their working lives with a lot of wealth. Most people don't, just a very few. It takes a while to build up. Anyway, most of these 20, she was actually able to discover whether they had died. And of the others, one went to prison and was declared bankrupt. And another gave away almost all that wealth in the first year, 2005. And did die subsequently. So there's one possibility that no way of checking on. People might be giving away enormous sums in future. So I should say straight away on the Warren Buffett question that Warren Buffett's average rate of return to capital in money terms, not allowed for inflation, over that 10-year period, measured just by seeing what happened to capital, grew at 3% a year, which is probably not really keeping up with the rising prices. But in Warren Buffett's case, that could well be because he's given a significant amount away. I think he discovered a way of finding out. I don't know if he speaks to the economists, so I haven't thought of that. Anyway, here is a summary of what we discovered. don't take what's written in the left-hand column literally. Of course, if I were to take the logarithm, this is the natural logarithm of the ratio of the 2 years, it would be very interesting. That's income, the wealth in the year 2005 divided by wealth in the year 2004. So then you start off with nearly 100 people who survived 2005, and you work out the mean, which in that year was 4% increase in capital, and the standard deviation in that year was 28% of the capital. And so on all the way down. The average in these years, which is always about survivors, what happened to them, is a mean of 4%, actually 4.4, and an average standard deviation of 28%. Now, what does the standard deviation mean for those of you who are not of Egypt or familiar with the idea? The chance of having a return number higher than the mean plus the standard deviation is 16%. The chance, at least with the normal distribution. This name will not be a normal distribution, but we're dealing with logs, so that it's not too far. Of course, the probability of having a return at least as big as the mean would be around 50%. Same for getting less than the mean minus the standard deviation. What that means is you've got 32% chance of a third, of being either getting a return in a year of either bigger than 32% or less than minus 24%. Minus 24% means that the capital falls by virtually a quarter. So enormous variation in what's happening to wealth each year. The average rate of return over the whole period, 4%, say 4.4% in money terms, is quite low, lower than the growth of the world economy over the period, which actually, for this group of people, which is the richest, the ones that I think particularly would expect to have the best return, actually contradicts this claim that the very wealthy are going, the wealthy are going to have their wealth grow faster in the economy, national income. And I suspect that that's a correct, not misleading observation. But what I really want to emphasize is that I think I got confirmation in my conjecture that a major source of inequality will be the great randomness of variability in the return, in what happens in people's capital year by year. We could say that wealth is walking random. Random walk is the term in mathematicians. There is actually, I have to say that it's not shown in the figures, there is some tendency to revert to the mean growth rate. So if your capital really jumps up one year, the next year it's more like forward statements. Very roughly. Hard to explain how that would be true. Following this random process for the whole population, if this were accurate for everybody, would generate a considerable part of the inequality that we actually observe, which kind of contradicts my current findings back again to the calculation, but that seems to be the situation. The random process seems to have occasional big jumps, separated by smooth periods when the capital doesn't change very rapidly at all. Well, this is very obvious for the few people that you might know something about. Bill Gates stays at the top, or almost at the top, of the wealth distribution year after year for a very long time. So what must have happened there was that he said, well, it's true, but he did something that gave it an enormous jump up in his capital. And then he simply sat back and let it happen smoothly. I would kind of conjecture that something may happen to the capital sometime in the next 20, 30 years. It might go the other way. Similarly with Warren Buffett, there would have been a point at which he had the really bright idea of how to proceed with his life. He continues to follow this relatively safe strategy. The point is that even if the capitalist can choose to have a high return by being clever, he can certainly choose to go for a higher return by taking a bigger risk, or to be content with a lower expected return and a lower risk. You would expect people to take these kinds of decisions differently at different times. What really surprised me was how very big the variability of returns is amongst a group of people who are mostly over 60. Because what you would expect is that younger people might be risk takers and you get high variability. So I'd love to have figures that told me about that. But you'd expect these older people to be sitting back and letting capital follow its own safe, quiet course. No, it doesn't happen. Total wealth cannot go on increasing faster than the national world, except by driving up property prices. And that, I don't believe, can really persist as long as we've got time. That's because real investment cannot be bigger than GDP, because GDP is production and investment is part of production. So the growth rate of fixed capital cannot be greater than GDP in the long run. Brand value, which is another form of wealth, might represent the possibility of continuing to do monopoly pricing for Microsoft Windows, Microsoft Office. These capital value. It's part of the wealth distribution that's observed. But that will be proportional to real output, so I don't see that as a source of growth faster. Well, this is where I want to disagree with Piketty's major conclusion. Now, why does all this stuff about the cause of inequality matter? It's basic principle of public finance, not much thought or expressed, that taxation ought to apply, taxation for the sake of redistribution, that's to say to the Robin Hood principle of taxation, should apply to the source of the inequality. I'd say it may well be that some people buy much nicer cars than others. It doesn't follow that you should tax the nicer car more heavily than the simpler one. Because they do that, the source of the inequality is the inequality of their incomes, of their income level. So what you should do is to tax people who earn a higher income, who earn a higher income, and subsidize people who earn a lower income. since we'll be looking for sources of inequality, of course we knew earnings were a source. And we're now seeing that excess income from capital is another source. Of course, that should include income from capital as well. And regarded as clear that one should tax income from capital as well as income from labor. But it looks as though of excess income from capital, excess earnings, are a major source of inequality, that we should be taxing higher returns more heavily than lower returns. So I think what it all leads to is that there should be a tax on profit income at a rate higher than the risk-free rate of return. Risk-free rate of return, well, you can use a reference rate of return like the interest rate on US Treasury bills or something like that. And look at excess profit. This is not so easy to do as you might hope. It's tricky to deal with this issue that what typically happens if somebody is a successful small enterprise writing a good new software game, that they can then sell it to a big company and make an enormous capital sum in a day. So for that year, excess return is very great. Nevertheless, the theory seems to suggest that if the higher rate of return is just luck, that you be taxed at a very high rate, close to 10%. This is one of the recommendations of the review of taxation, which came out a few years ago. One should tax this way. The recommendation was put forward on the basis of my conjecture. We haven't tested that it was actually true. But probably the higher return is not just luck. An element of skill is involved. Most investors, if they look honestly at what happened to their investments, look back to our fund managers who are supposed to be very skilled. Would find that certainly the average person would find that they have done less well than they would have if they just bought a random mix of shares on the stock market. Nevertheless, I'm prepared to say that tax shouldn't be quite as high as 100% or even 90%, but maybe not much less. So that's the conclusion. What can you do about it?
Les van a dar el micrófono y cuando den el micrófono hablan, por favor. ¿Sí? ¿Que les vi un momento? Hay dos personas que van a pasar con los micrófonos, se supone. Sí, aquí vienen un momento. Ok, a ver, todos. Si quieren, podemos empezar aquí con el caballero. Aquí.
Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting and enthusiastic for research. But what will happen if we introduce into your reflection the production systems and capital accumulation among countries? Yeah? Because what I'm saying, at the end of the Second World War, we were interested in development economics about how to reduce the gap between rich countries and poor countries. And we were on the idea of trying to the lower poor, trying to industrialize to get more wealth. So I guess that if you introduce that type of analysis, some of the reflections that you bring in could change, because what we will be interested is in public policy, not only taxing the rich, but trying to reduce the gap between rich countries and poor countries. Still one thing that is required for the world economy.
Actually, I think I understand. Well, I'm a very strong proponent of doing more about inequality amongst countries. And I agree that has to involve, what I claim that it has to involve transfers between countries still. That's to say, economic aid is quite important. It's interesting when you look at what figures are available. You'd have to say that much the largest part of what you could properly call development aid comes from governments within the poorer countries, going to the poorer parts of the countries. And the richer countries haven't done very much. But they've been generous with advice. Probably not always the best of advice. But it does look as though. But maybe the most striking feature of what has happened so far, those countries that could say are showing the way of how you can get out of poverty and low incomes. Many of which are in Asia, because they're very large populations, a very big way, is that they seem to have done things in a rather different way. Trade has been, international trade has been important for all of them, which is something quite different, I'd say. Of course, that was, we say, well, what were the valuable pieces of advice to the developed world, to the less developed world, and allow trade to develop. Was one of them. But of course, it was partly developed by young researchers like Mangan Singh coming to the West and doing the PhD thesis in the West, coming to these kinds of conclusions. So it's not all right advice from the rich. But I actually think seriously that advice ought to be important. If only we could agree what to say. Because some things like the desirability or otherwise of property rights may well be exactly wrong. Doesn't seem to be treated as controversial. I think there are lots of interesting questions, but I'm not at all intending to say that this was the only thing to be done, because that means focusing on how you affect the change. But there is an element there that might be very relevant. Ideally, this is to say that you provide money to development is somehow conditional. What you get back or you get anything back. But actually you should get something back. Will be conditional on how well people do. So there's an analogy to what I was saying about taxing the excess return capital. The idea that perhaps poor countries should only have to pay back lower if the national income grows faster. And it's something that tended to happen with the forgiveness of debt in Africa. And it wasn't known in advance. Because the whole point of this is that it should be known in advance after the contract. Now this idea of conditional cash, loan cash transfers, is not unknown in Mexico, which we were pioneer. The conditionality there was conditionality about sending children to school. I think that's an area that deserves further thought. It's analogous to what I was just talking about.
Thank you very much for your lecture, Sir Curley. I have a question, and it's, how much does mathematical rigorosity impact the development and understanding of your economic models? And what do you think can be advantages and disadvantages of having less or more mathematical rigor? Thank you.
I seldom do economics without expressing it in mathematics. But I nowadays frequently give lectures where I leave the mathematics out. It's sort of in this one and the whole framework of stochastic processes, the connection between uncertainty and the resulting distribution, which obviously I couldn't get into when you leave mathematics out to communicate to a wider audience. It's an interesting example of inequality, of course. People find mathematics helpful and less helpful in varying degrees. So I wouldn't be in favor of redistribution, taking mathematical skills away from some people and giving more to others. But I think that indeed it's very valuable. What's implicit in your question is very hard to answer, which is whether the mathematics is useful to me, because that's the way my training happened. Whereas somebody else not like there wouldn't be much use trying to get me to use Spanish or thinking about things, because I don't know Spanish. And it doesn't follow from that, because some things will be written in Spanish, that I should learn Spanish, because nowadays I'm not very good at learning languages. And I could probably find out that material in another language. I don't think the mathematical situation is quite like that. It used to be claimed after Marshall famously, so suddenly you should leave the mathematics and footnotes or appendices at the end of the book and explain everything in words. I certainly don't think that everything can be explained or worked out in words. That's very obvious once you start writing down a model that you want to test against reality. And the great problem is that without mathematics it becomes virtually impossible to have disciplined empirical testing of the correctness of otherwise of your opinions. So I think that is the major reason why we need mathematics in economics. Although for me, it's also an enormous help for thinking.
Mr. Mirlees, welcome to Mexico. My question is, what happened in a country as Mexico with the funds, pension funds, afores, if in Mexico exists maybe devaluation? What happened? Thank you. Do you understand?
I'm not sure if I entirely did, but I think you were asking about the impact of devaluations in medicine. And it's true I was here when one of them happened, but I actually don't know anything about what happened to the Mexican economy. I'm afraid there's no use asking me about the Mexican economy. I'm relatively ignorant.
I want to thank you also for the talk. Sorry, I want to thank you for the talk. It was very eye-opening for me. But surprisingly, you mentioned that young people are not risk takers. So I was
On the contrary, I thought they would be listening.
well, I want to ask you about what advice would you give us, young adults, in order to take a more active role in a world economy? Well, it's because, as you showed us, most of the income, the people with most income are also older people. So how do you think a youngster could be part of that group?
Well, the major way of joining this group is to stick around and grow old. and be successful all of these first 60 years, at least a reasonable number of years. The difficulty with the work I was showing you and what I'm discovering there is it doesn't suggest anything about advice of the kind you ask. As far as this data goes, the different returns that different people get on that capital, I say the different degree of success on the economic success in the year for them could be entirely random. It's just a matter of chance. And if that's true, it's clearly impossible to give advice. But of course, it can only happen because they put themselves in the way of big returns. They only got big returns because that was a possibility. A lot of investments people do or jobs people take have no possibility of getting very rich like this. And I can't help but think part of the advice has to be, as far as I can see, there's no personal advantage in doing that. I don't know why you would want to in this club. But apparently, a lot of them are there because they wanted to. It's something, these are very few people, 100 people. And there are probably more than 100 people who want to be very, very rich like this. But it seems to me that's something one should grow out of. wanted to do was contribute to the world economy.
Yeah.
And that's fine. So I think you have to be prepared to take risks. Because I think it's a pretty clear message, not only from this kind of work, but lots of other, that what the world economy needs is quite a lot of people taking quite big risks, because enough of them will succeed that it provides advantages. That's what I mean when I say investment. Useful investment is intrinsically risky, but we really need it. Of course, in some way it needs to be rewarded to encourage people to do it. But you want advice on how to take risks. I don't have in mind going to retire.
My question is in terms of my question is related to the 100 people that from Forbes that you studied, and that has to do with. I wonder to what extent those 100 people were there in that list because of they were able to capture rents in the world economy, especially in the last in the years that you studied, where for instance the break of the Soviet Union, very rich people took advantage of certain monopolies or quasi monopolies or state property that was given to private owners. If you had any idea of that, and to what extent that is a major source of inequality at that level, I wouldn't say in other places, but with these number of people. And secondly, it seems to me that, as you mentioned, capital gains, which come from risky operations, can be a major source of inequality. But I would say that seems to me that would go on in countries where most of the income comes from these different sources, whereas in poorer countries where most income comes from labor earnings, that they don't have a source of that. I don't know if I am making myself understood. If you have a poor country, most earnings come from labor rather than capital or investment. And so it's a bit tricky to say that inequality in those other situations is a major source. It comes from, especially from capital income, from risk investments. I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, certainly the spreadsheets that my research assistant has prepared for me contain some things that might be helpful to you. I might think that it would be impossible to respond effectively to that. But for example, the nationality of every one of the 100 is listed, and also what they do. But I haven't tried to sort it out, so I have to go back to my computer and have a look. But I do have some impressions. The striking feature is that indeed Americans are a pretty large proportion of the 100. And not only that, but most of these Americans are in business. They do things like developing Walmart or Microsoft. There's clearly an element of the reward to developing Microsoft. All it does is it comes in terms of what we would certainly call rents or monopoly profits. But it is a proper incentive, and there has to be an incentive to raise that. So it's not like this sort of robber baron events at the breakup of the Soviet Union that you were referring to. Yeah, there are some Russians there. I mentioned somebody who went to prison and was declared bankrupt. The name was Russian. So they don't necessarily do. I think that happened in 2005 before he was in the list, so it's not in the statistics. So my impression, my recollection of looking back at all of this would be that no, this is not the events of the kind that you thought. Mainly it's more straightforward business enterprise. But then there are, that doesn't mean that it was all socially productive. You can see that it's a bit hard to decide whether Adelson is one of the most striking games over the period, who made his money by establishing casinos and associated services. It's just the kind of thing we were happy to see encouraged. Difficult. The second question was, what about the richer and poorer countries? Well, of course, there aren't very many people in this from the really poor countries. But Mexico, of course, is not underrepresented. This is another example of somebody who has control of the resource, oil in this case. That's ranked in a sort of legitimate sense, but to what extent do you think it was the, I think that perhaps can count reasonably as well. It seems very analogous to the same kind of thing in the richer countries, Australia or the US. But in the main, you're probably right with a different character, but it's not going to be caught by the Forbes lists, because what you're talking about is almost certainly mainly people who are back down in the $10 million range.
In the last 40 years, we have had this model of taxes that is opposite of you are proposing. It's because now the main assets are about less than 1%, 45% of the assets are less of 1% of the population. And in the other hand, we have almost 4 million of people under the poverty line. So we have the last place in the ranking of all the international institutions, because we have the last place in the organization of operation for the. So we have three with Chile, Mexico. We have the last places in the distribution of, in the distribution of income. I'm sorry.
So I missed some of what you were saying, when I'm too quiet.
Well, that's the last figures that we have, and are really, and the model of international fund not going to change, and we have a similar situation of Spain or another countries. In each one countries, we have a very bad distribution of our income, and the model is going on. And my question is, what can we do? Because now we have all these promises of investment in the oil and energy sector that we are opening very recently. So that's my question. How can we manage to improve our distribution of income that it points to the people which is really needed? And that's my question.
In one form or another, I think the only way that you can improve the basic income distribution is by what I would call redistributive taxation. That although economists have for a long time been very keen on simply cash payments, and indeed Mexico does some of this, it seems very difficult to persuade governments to go that far. And I'm not saying that that can quickly achieve everything you want. It's kind of indicating something better, but I would have to say that the countries that have been most successful in reducing poverty, which I think is the best measure for this kind of thing, countries that really didn't do a lot of direct distribution, that's to say the subsidies that reach the very poor were not very precisely directed and not very big. They mainly reduced poverty by expanding employment in urban areas and going into producing things where they had the advantage of they could use large supply of low-cost labor. Now Mexico clearly has done quite a lot of that. The question I've been asking people while I'm here is, are there particular barriers to investment coming from other countries? And I'm not saying this is the best way of dealing with the problem. I still prefer redistributive taxation, but I think it's an important element to do to help. What you must want is more growth. And you get more growth by having more investment in the right kinds of things. And how can you get more investment? Well, on the whole, the sensible thing is for people to invest their savings in many countries. So Mexico should expect to have a lot of its investment financed from overseas. And because of the problem of many investors like to make very short term, to buy assets that are very liquid, and this can cause problems. I think you certainly want, ideally, direct foreign investment. In other words, long-term loans without liquidity. But I haven't discovered whether there are particular difficulties and reasons, but people seem to think that there just isn't enough investment in Mexico. However, you can compare with some other countries in a similar position. I suppose another obvious as I say, what would be the most obvious difference between Korea and Mexico? Currently, they're about the same growth rate. Of course, Mexico hardly knows what unemployment is. It's not terribly high in Mexico. But the big difference is that almost all of the 18-year-olds in Korea go on to further higher education, many of them to university. They have an increasingly very well-educated labor force, to look at it from the economist standpoint. And I understand that only 78% of the age group in Mexico go to university. And I have no idea how many of them finish the courses. So, I'm not saying that the answer is simply to expand universities, because the problem may come from something to do with the quality of schools at the university level. And I can't throw any light on that. But of course, typically the answer to that kind of question is very various. There's a couple of suggestions. Get more investment and get more education.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. And my question is focused on the capital gains tax. I already know that the capital gains tax could reduce the inequality with the investment returns, but exist negative consequences of the capital gains tax, specifically if we establish the rates too low or too higher, and if it exists an optimal point to establish the tax, the rate of the capital gains tax.
Yeah, it's a very difficult one to find out, because the answer to what's the best rate turns on the question to what extent the returns here are really random. Really the issue is that the tax should not be so high that willingness to do risky investments disappears. And because there have been quite a lot of, presumably there is a capital gains tax now. You can see what has, you have to look at the data and see what has happened as that rate has changed, what has happened to the rate of investment. But what you really need first to develop a rather narrow definition of investment. Definitely looks at the kinds of investments that lead to capital gains, the kind that we want to tax. I mean, there are also issues like whether you want to tax the capital gains on paintings or something like that. But that's a separate issue from what we're talking about. Now, I agree it's good to get it right, but there is always a basic mathematician sort of point that if you knew what the optimal tax rate it was for this, then if you imagine a curve that shows the welfare arising from different tax rates, it's going to be very flat nearby. So therefore you don't lose a lot by being wrong by 10%. So you don't need to get this very accurate.
Yes, I'd like to ask you about the following issue. Do you believe that in order to solve or at least reduce in some degree the problematic that you show us today, could we rely at some amount of degree in the implementation of some of the postulates of Friedrich Hayek. I mean, the current situation of the world economy.
I don't think I can comment on that. My ignorance of Hayek, of course, a famous name is enormous. I've never thought, I mean, there's not that kind of economics is not my case. It's sort of very unquantitative. So I find it quite difficult to know exactly what point is being made. But part of the difference from my approach is I'm willing to imagine almost any kind of uncertainty being described by probability. And he's clearly very uncomfortable about that. And as a result, when he talks about uncertainties, the things I can get a hold of, and I don't know how you verify the truth of claims that he or his disciples. So I'm not a hierarchy.
Sé que hay muchas preguntas más, les agradezco mucho su interés. Tenemos ya que parar. Como ven, este es un campo muy vasto, muy interesante, muy relevante, muy relacionado con las matemáticas. Espero que esta conferencia haya servido para motivar a algunos de nuestros jóvenes a cultivarse en esta disciplina que podemos llamar la economía matemática. Y quiero que por favor le agradezcamos al profesor Mirlees esta fantástica conferencia que nos dio.
Thank you very much for the lecture, Professor Mirlees. And Sir James Mirrlees, thank you very much for your conference. A little present of all the faculty school. For the School of Science. Yes, it's
Yes.
Thank you very much. Gracias a todos.